June 2nd, 1943. Somewhere over the Mediterranean, south of Sicily. The Junkers Ju-88 shuddered like a wounded animal as flak bursts chewed the sky around it. The air was thick with the smell of burning oil and cordite. Shards of metal rattled off the fuselage like hailstones against a tin roof. Oberfeldwebel Karl Hoffmann's gloved hands were slick with sweat inside the controls, his headset crackling with frantic German voices. The altimeter needle trembled. One engine coughed, spat flame, and then began to trail a long, greasy ribbon of smoke. "Wir verlieren Höhe! We're losing altitude!" shouted the navigator, Lieutenant Ernst Meyer, his face ghostly pale in the flickering red lights of the cockpit. Outside, the night wasn't truly dark. Searchlights probed upward in wavering cones of white, and the distant flashes of explosions sketched sharp, brutal silhouettes of other aircraft. Somewhere below, Allied guns spoke in rhythmic thunder, each burst a promise that they were not welcome here. You're in the nose of the bomber now, pressed up behind the plexiglass, feeling every vibration in your chest. The metal skin of the plane feels paper thin. Each flak burst is a hammer blow, each streaking tracer a needle threading death through the air. "Prepare to bail out," the pilot yelled, his voice barely cutting through the rising howl of tortured engines. "We can't make it back to Sicily." Karl's first thought wasn't of home or glory. It was of something his training officer had said months earlier, back in Germany. Better to die in the air than fall into enemy hands. The Americans are butchers. The British are worse. The words come back now like a curse, riding on the taste of smoke in his mouth. Behind him, in the cramped rear fuselage, Funker Otto Weiss clutched his headset and machine gun mount, knuckles white. "Karl," he shouted down the narrow corridor. "If they capture us, then they capture us!" Karl barked back, surprising himself with how steady he sounded. "Jump, or the plane will be our grave." The bomber lurched violently, the damaged wing dipping. For a moment, gravity seemed to twist sideways and the floor tilted out from under them. Loose maps fluttered like wounded birds. A wrench tumbled past, clanging off the bulkhead. "Jetzt! Now!" One by one, the crew scrambled to the hatch. Wind tore at their uniforms as soon as the door cracked open, roaring into the fuselage like a living thing. The sky beyond was a chaotic swirl of searchlight beams, tracer fire, and cloud. Karl hesitated at the edge. One heartbeat. Two. Below lay the enemy. Men who, he'd been told, would starve him, beat him, grind him down until he was less than human. Behind him, fire crept along the wing. He jumped. The cold hit him first, an all-consuming shock as the wind hammered his body. The world became a tumble of black sea, jagged coastline, and fragmented moonlight. His parachute snapped open with a brutal jerk that tore the breath from his lungs. Below, the Mediterranean loomed, dark and glossy, like spilled ink. He hit the water hard. The impact drove the air from him, icy waves swallowing his scream. Salt burned his eyes and throat as he fought to free himself from the parachute harness, tangled cords dragging him under. For one terrifying moment, the weight of soaked cloth and equipment seemed determined to pull him into the black depths forever. Then, His hand found the clasp. The harness released. The parachute drifted away like a pale ghost on the surface. He gasped, sucking in ragged breaths of cold night air. Somewhere nearby, another voice shouted in German, a raw, panicked cry. "Otto?" Karl called, blinking away seawater. "Ernst?" A distant searchlight swept the waves, briefly illuminating the froth and the bobbing dark shapes of other parachutes. Engines droned high above, but the bomber that had carried them here was gone, either falling in flames or lost somewhere in the black sky. Minutes stretched into what felt like an hour. Waves slapped his face. Each breath tasted of salt and fear. His legs burned as he kicked, clinging to the small inflatable cushion strapped to his belt. Finally, the grind of an engine grew louder, closer. Not the deep thrum of an aircraft, but the harsher, chopping churn of a boat. "Hold up a light," someone ordered in accented English. "We've got more of them out here." Karl's heart jolted. He tried to make himself smaller in the water, as if he could hide in the sea itself. But a beam of white light speared the darkness, catching the shine of his wet flight jacket. "There!" another voice called. "Kraut's in the water!" You see it now as Karl does. The looming shadow of a patrol boat, its bow cutting through the waves. The beam of a handheld searchlight pinning him in place like an insect on a card. Men leaned over the railing, helmets outlined against the sky. He could make out the shapes of rifles, the glint of steel. Rough hands hauled him aboard. The deck was cold, gritty with salt and oil beneath his boots. Water streamed from his uniform, pooling around his feet. Two American sailors in bulky life jackets and steel helmets stood in front of him, their faces shadowed. One had a Thompson slung casually over his shoulder, finger resting near the trigger. "Got yourself in a hell of a mess, buddy," the sailor said in English, his tone weary rather than angry. "You speak any English?" Karl glared, jaws clenched. His training came back to him. Name, rank, serial number, nothing more. Never relax, never trust. The Americans, they'd been told, would leave you to rot. Still, as he stared at them, something inside him recoiled at how normal they looked. Young, tired. Not the monsters the propaganda posters had shown, with fangs and claws and eyes dripping blood. He said nothing. "Fine," the sailor shrugged. "We'll have plenty of time to chat where you're going." Where you're going. The phrase lodged in Karl's mind as the boat turned toward the faint glow of a distant harbor. Captivity. A camp. Barbed wire and empty bowls. Days later, after interrogation and transfer, the crossing of an entire ocean in the steel belly of a crowded transport ship, that phrase returned to him again. Where you're going. Because as the train brakes squealed and the doors slid open onto a sunlit platform in the heart of the United States of America, the first thing that hit him wasn't hunger. It was the smell. Thick, rich, impossible. Roasted meat drifting on warm air, and the unmistakable bitter-sweet aroma of freshly brewed coffee. The scent didn't make sense. Karl stood on the wooden platform, boots planted on American soil for the first time, his wrists still sore from the restraints used during transport. Around him, the other prisoners hesitated as well, craning their necks, sniffing the air like confused animals. This wasn't the sharp, metallic smell of fear he expected. It wasn't rot, wasn't thin soup, wasn't starvation. It was warm, savory, comforting. A military policeman walked by, holding a metal thermos that steamed in the morning sun. Without slowing, he spoke over his shoulder. "Mess hall's about 5 minutes that way. They'll get you sorted." Prisoners glanced at each other. Some frowned. Some whispered. Mess hall? The word felt alien. Lieutenant Meyer finally broke the silence. "Carl, do you smell that?" "I do," Carl said cautiously. "Meat." They'd eaten barley water and stale bread for days at sea. Back home in Germany, rationing meant even civilians rarely saw real meat unless they were well connected. Soldiers at the front ate better than most, but the idea that American prison camps were cooking with it had to be a trick. The column of German POWs shuffled forward under the watch of relaxed but alert American guards. MP patches glinted in the sun. Batons hung from belts. Rifles rested in the crooks of arms. Their demeanor was professional, but not hostile. The camp looked nothing like the nightmares German propaganda had painted. No skeletal prisoners, no guards with whips. No torture sheds. Instead, barracks lined in neat rows, laundry flapping from clotheslines. A baseball field visible just beyond a fence. A Red Cross station with a nurse handing out blankets. And next to the gate, of all things, an ice machine. Obergefreiter Otto Weiss stared at it, as though it were a hallucination. "Carl, they have ice." Carl didn't respond. His mind had become a battlefield between what he'd been told and what he was seeing. Inside the camp processing building, the Germans were instructed, through interpreters, to remove their belts, surrender knives, list any injuries, and step onto marked spots for medical checks. The Americans inspected their boots, asked about illnesses, and passed out small paper tags with identification numbers. But it was what came next that caught Carl completely off guard. A sergeant pointed him toward another room. "Step this way. You'll get your issue." Carl entered, expecting shackles, a club, a beating. Instead, a supply corporal handed him a clean towel, 2 bars of soap, a toothbrush, a tin cup, a mess kit, a wool blanket, and finally, "Here's your Red Cross comfort kit. Don't lose it." Carl blinked. "Mine was..." The interpreter nodded. "Comfort kit. Razor, writing paper, envelopes, shoelaces, comb, sewing needles, playing cards. From the Red Cross. Provided to all POWs here. Comfort kit." The word struck him harder than any interrogation would have. But the true shock came when they were marched into the mess hall. The building was enormous, far larger than any German barracks mess Carl had ever seen. Rows of long wooden tables stretched from wall to wall. Prisoners filed in, each holding their new tin tray. Steam rose from metal lunch counters where American cooks ladled food at a steady rhythm. And the food, God in heaven. Thick slices of roast beef, mashed potatoes glistening with melted butter, bread still warm from the oven, green beans sautéed with onions, even a scoop of canned peaches, and of course, the coffee. Dark, hot, bitter, alive. Carl froze in place. His throat tightened. His stomach growled so violently that the cook behind the counter laughed. "Long trip, huh?" the American said, dropping a slab of meat onto Carl's tray. "Eat up. You boys look like you need it." Carl stared at the food as though it might vanish. Was this some kind of psychological trick to break them? Were hidden cameras recording them? Would eating it mark them as weak? Around him, other POWs showed similar hesitation. Some whispered prayers of thanks. Some looked suspicious. Some simply began devouring the food as though the war might steal it away any second. Carl finally sat across from Meyer and Otto at a table near the wall. "This is impossible," Meyer murmured. "They are fattening us for something." Otto shook his head, a forkful of peach halfway to his mouth. "Then let them. If this is my last meal, I'll die happy." But Carl couldn't eat yet. He studied the guards, their relaxed posture, their easy banter with each other. No one shouted. No one barked orders. Back home, Nazi officers barely treated their own troops with this much respect, let alone prisoners. He remembered the words of his training officer again. "The Americans are butchers. You will starve in their camps." But here he was, soaking in warmth, surrounded by smells that made his eyes sting with memories of home. His mother's Sunday kitchen, a cafe in Munich. It didn't fit. None of it fit. "Eat, Carl," Otto said quietly, "before someone wakes us up." Carl looked down at the tray again. The steam curled upward like an invitation. He took the first bite. The meat was tender, juicy, perfectly salted. It melted on his tongue. His eyes closed involuntarily. In that moment, the war felt very far away. And for the first time, a strange new thought crept through his mind. What if everything we were told was wrong? Carl didn't speak for several minutes after that first bite. None of the men at the table did. The mess hall buzzed with quiet disbelief. Forks scraping metal trays, cups clinking, low murmurs of German drifting around the room like smoke. But no one raised their voice. No one dared to break the strange spell. It felt wrong. Not because the food wasn't good, it was excellent, but because it was kind. Kindness wasn't something they'd been trained to expect from an enemy. Carl finally swallowed the mouthful of roast beef and leaned back, the tin cup of hot coffee warming his hands. The bitterness curled across his tongue, familiar and yet foreign. They'd been told Americans drank weak, syrupy coffee. This was stronger than anything he'd had since the war began. "They're trying to confuse us," Meyer muttered, eyes darting from guard to guard. "They want us off balance." "Then they're succeeding," Otto said, stuffing another forkful of potatoes into his mouth. The door at the far end clapped open, and an American sergeant stepped in. He scanned the room, took in the tense quiet, and let out a short chuckle. "They always look like this the first day," he told another MP beside him. "Give 'em a week, they'll be asking for seconds." Carl didn't know whether to feel insulted or relieved. A week? They were expected to be alive in a week? After the meal, the prisoners were escorted to the recreation area, another concept that seemed absurd. Recreation? For POWs? What was next? Hotels? Yet the Americans processed them through everything as though handling newly arrived factory workers, not enemy combatants. The recreation yard was surrounded by high barbed wire fences, yes, but inside, the open space was shockingly normal. A dusty baseball diamond, picnic tables under a wooden pavilion, a small stage where a band of American soldiers rehearsed swing music, and near the far fence, a chalkboard listing today's schedule. 0800 physical fitness, 1000 English lessons, voluntary, 1300 soccer match, POW Team A versus Team B, 1600 library hours. Carl stared at the chalkboard so long, an MP finally tapped his shoulder. You can attend if you want. None of it's mandatory except roll call. He didn't move, couldn't move. This didn't just contradict German propaganda, it annihilated it. The sharp slap of a baseball meeting a glove drew his attention. A group of American soldiers were practicing throws near the far end of the field. After a minute, the pitcher pointed at the Germans watching over the fence and waved. "You boys play?" he shouted. "Anyone want a turn?" Meyer instinctively stepped back. Otto blinked in confusion. Carl felt his stomach twist. German training hammered into them that fraternization with the enemy was treason. But the Americans didn't seem to care about the war in that moment at all. To them, this was a camp full of men, soldiers, sure, but soldiers who were no longer threats. One of the guards leaned on his rifle casually. "This camp's got 3 soccer teams," he said. "Your guys are better at that than we are. And we've got a few baseball gloves for those who want to try something new." Carl couldn't help asking the question that had been clawing at his throat since the mess hall. Why? The guard looked at him, puzzled. "Why what?" "Why treat us this way?" Carl asked. "Food, music, games." The guard shrugged, as though the question itself were strange. "The war will end someday. Until then, you're prisoners, not animals." Carl didn't know how to respond. Was that how Americans thought? He suddenly remembered a lecture from a party officer years earlier. The Americans rule by greed. They care only about themselves. They have no respect for life. Yet standing here, surrounded by sunlight and fresh air and the sounds of a baseball game, Carl felt that belief peeling away like old paint. In the barracks later, the prisoners were assigned sleeping bunks, not luxurious, but solid, with clean sheets and warm blankets. Each barrack had a potbelly stove for winter, a writing desk, and a small bulletin board with camp rules typed neatly in both English and German. Carl sat on his bunk, elbows resting on his knees, staring at nothing. Otto lay on his back on the bunk across from him. "If this is captivity," he sighed happily, "I might stay." Meyer snorted. "Don't be ridiculous." But even he sounded unsure. Carl's thoughts churned. This treatment, this strange decency, didn't mean the Americans would stop fighting. Didn't mean they weren't enemies. Didn't erase the destroyed cities, the fallen comrades, the fire-bombed factories. But it did mean something else, something far more dangerous. It meant the world wasn't as simple as he'd been taught. It meant the enemy wasn't a caricature. It meant the truth was bigger, messier, and harder to ignore. Outside, a whistle sounded, calling other prisoners to the evening assembly. The day was winding down, but Carl felt like something was waking up inside him. An uncomfortable nagging awareness that nothing he'd believed about the Americans aligned with the reality he was living. That night, as Carl pulled the wool blanket up to his chest, he felt the warmth seep through him. Not just physical warmth, but the unsettling warmth of doubt. Doubt in the Reich. Doubt in the party. Doubt in the words of the men who sent him to war. And for the first time since the Junkers had gone down over the Mediterranean, Carl wondered not just whether he would survive the war, but what he would believe about it when it was over. Morning in the camp came softly. A bugle call drifted across the compound, echoing through the rows of barracks in a gentle, almost lazy melody. It wasn't the sharp, punishing blast Carl remembered from German training grounds. Instead, it sounded like something from a distant farm. Calm, almost inviting. When he sat up, sunlight filtered through the slats of the wooden window, painting thin stripes across the barracks floor. Otto was already awake, tying his boots with exaggerated satisfaction. "Another day in paradise," Otto said, grinning like a fool. Meyer groaned from the lower bunk. "Stop calling it that." Carl didn't reply. He'd slept deeply, deeper than he had in months, but his mind had been restless. All night he kept replaying the same thoughts. Why treat prisoners this well? What did the Americans gain from it? And why did it make him feel so ashamed? When the morning roll call ended, the prisoners were free to roam within the fence line. Carl followed the others to the recreation yard, drawn by the sound of a crowd gathering. A soccer match was already underway. The POWs had formed two teams, one representing former Luftwaffe crews, another representing infantry units. Even from a distance, Carl could hear the laughter, the shouts, the friendly insults exchanged. It felt like a summer afternoon in Munich, more than a wartime prison camp in America. As Carl approached, an American MP leaned casually on the fence, watching the game. "You played back home?" he asked Carl, without looking away from the field. Carl hesitated, unsure how to speak casually with a man in uniform who held his life in his hands. "A little, before the war." "You should join in." The MP nodded toward the field. "You boys are quick. Yesterday you wiped the floor with the Italian team we brought in last month." Carl blinked. Italians. POWs from a completely different front. All mixed here, playing games side by side. It was unthinkable in the Reich. Back home, prisoners from different units or nations were kept apart, divided, controlled, weakened. But here, Americans seemed content to let everyone mingle. The MP shrugged when Carl didn't answer. "Suit yourself. Coffee's up at the mess tent if you want some." Coffee. Again. It was becoming a symbol of this strange new world. Hot, plentiful, freely offered. Carl wandered toward the mess tent, where a few dozen prisoners stood around metal urns of steaming black coffee. Some were reading newspapers the Americans had distributed, English-language newspapers no less, handed out with German-language pamphlets encouraging POWs to learn the language. It was another bizarre detail. Why give prisoners newspapers? Why allow them to read about the world, about the war's progress, about Allied victories and German losses? Inside the tent, Carl accepted a tin cup filled to the brim. Across the room, a POW named Franz Bittner, a former school teacher, was animatedly explaining something to a group of younger men. "Look at this," Bittner said, waving the newspaper. "They print casualty numbers. Real ones. They criticize their own generals. They even criticize the president. Imagine printing something like this back home." A few prisoners stiffened at the comment, glancing toward the MPs. But the American guards didn't react. They didn't care. They weren't listening. Or perhaps they didn't consider open discussion a threat the way the Germans did. Carl took a slow sip of coffee, feeling its warmth cut through him. "What do you think?" Bittner asked suddenly, catching him in his stare. Carl lowered his cup. "I think—" He paused, struggling to pick the right words. "I think it is dangerous to believe what the enemy gives you." Bittner smiled softly. "Then look around you, Hoffman. Look at the barracks, the food, the guards who treat us like men." He tapped the newspaper. "Ask yourself which version of America is true, the one on these pages or the one we were told about?" Carl swallowed hard. He didn't want this conversation. Didn't want to admit the obvious. Didn't want to feel the ground shifting beneath his beliefs. But it was. Every hour, every meal, every small act of unexpected kindness. When he stepped outside again, he found a group of officers gathered near the fence, muttering quietly. Their uniforms were immaculate, their posture stiff, but their faces betrayed unease. Hauptmann Vogel, a senior officer Carl vaguely recognized, spoke in a low voice, but with visible agitation. "This cannot continue," Vogel said. "The men are becoming soft, too comfortable. They forget who they are." "They're adapting," another officer replied cautiously. "They're being manipulated," Vogel snapped. "Don't you see it? The enemy wants to destroy us from inside our own minds, break morale, break loyalty." Carl listened quietly, but didn't step closer. The officers weren't wrong. Not entirely. But were they right? Was comfort manipulation? Was food coercion? Was fairness a trap? Back home, they'd been told that weakness took many forms: an uneasy smile, a moment of relaxation, a soft bed, a full stomach. Things that eroded vigilance, things that rotted the steel of German discipline. But here, for the first time since the war began, Carl felt human again, and the feeling terrified him. Later that afternoon, he passed the camp library for the first time. The small wooden building had shelves of books in both English and German. Novels, manuals, history texts, and even Goethe and Schiller. Prisoners were quietly reading, taking notes, or practicing English phrases. One book, lying open on a table near the entrance, caught Carl's eye. The Spirit of Democracy. Before he could stop himself, he reached out and touched the page. This place wasn't a prison. Not really. Not the way he expected. It was something far stranger. A place where the enemy didn't try to brutalize him. A place where they seemed genuinely uninterested in crushing prisoners into submission. A place where loyalty wasn't enforced through fear. A place where questions grew like weeds he couldn't pull fast enough. As he stood there, staring at the book, the realization slipped into his mind like a whisper he'd tried desperately to avoid. If this is America's way of war, then maybe everything we were taught about them, everything, is a lie. The first letter arrived 3 weeks into camp life. Carl had been sweeping the barracks floor with a stiff, bristled broom when an MP stepped inside, holding a small bundle of envelopes. "Mail call! Hoffman! Carl! Any Hoffman here?" Carl froze. Mail? For him? He raised a hand. "Here." The MP handed him a thin, cream-colored envelope marked with censored stamps, Red Cross routing codes, and his identification number. The handwriting on the front was unmistakably his mother's, shaky, careful, full of worry pressed into every stroke. Carl held it for a long moment, suddenly afraid to open it. He hadn't been allowed to write yet. Processing delays, they'd said. But somehow a letter from home had found its way to him. Otto nudged him. "Open it, Mensch. Don't make me eat it myself to find out what it says." Carl sat on his bunk and carefully tore the flap. Inside, his mother wrote, "My dear Carl, we heard nothing for many weeks. I feared the worst. Then the Red Cross informed us you were alive, in American hands. They promised you were safe and treated well. I pray it is true. Eat whatever they give you, my son. Stay warm. Stay strong. We wait for you. Mother." Carl read the words twice, then a third time. Safe. Treated well. The Red Cross said so. He looked around the barracks, the stove, the neat bunks, the stack of fresh firewood, the clean water barrel. For once, the Red Cross report wasn't propaganda. It was simply accurate. He felt a weight in his chest, relief mixed with guilt. Meyer leaned over his shoulder. "Does she say anything about the front?" Carl shook his head, folding the letter. "She tells me to eat. Then she'd be pleased." Otto stabbed a thumb toward the mess hall. "Roast chicken today." The daily routine in camp had become strangely predictable, almost peaceful. Morning roll call, breakfast, work duty or classes, afternoon recreation, evening roll call, lights out. But the letters were becoming something else entirely. For weeks now, prisoners had been allowed to send 1 letter a month and receive 2. At first, the officers drafted stiff formal instructions forbidding anyone from writing too positively about camp conditions. "Do not praise the Americans," Hauptmann Vogel warned. "Do not undermine morale back home. Our families must know we remain loyal." But rumors were spreading. Letters from Germany hinted at bombings, shortages, missing neighbors, missing soldiers. Some hinted at things worse, things not spoken openly. The Reich was changing. The war was changing. And the letters POWs sent home? Well, they were carefully censored by the Americans, yes. But the contents still slipped through. Carl noticed it one afternoon while sitting at one of the long writing tables in the library. He looked left, then right. Every single man around him wrote almost the exact same opening sentence. "I am safe. I am treated well. We are given enough to eat." Not one wrote, "We are starving. We are beaten. Americans are monsters," because that wasn't true, not even remotely. What terrified the officers wasn't American censorship. It was American generosity. It was the truth. One evening, Carl stepped outside to the recreation yard, just as a heated argument broke out near the fence. A knot of prisoners had gathered, their voices sharp. "You can't write that!" Hauptmann Vogel barked at a younger soldier, clutching a half-finished letter. "Erase it, immediately!" "It's the truth," the soldier argued, jaw tight. "My father thinks I'm suffering. I won't lie to him." "You will," Vogel snapped, "or we will report you to the German camp spokesman." "You know what that means." Carl winced. Camp spokesmen, elected by POWs, often became enforcers of Nazi discipline inside the camps. Some were harmless. Some were not. The young soldier's hands trembled. "Sir, what difference does it make if they know we are treated fairly?" "Because the Reich depends on morale," Vogel hissed. "If Germany hears that its enemies are benevolent, that its soldiers are comfortable in captivity," he jabbed a finger at the soldier's chest, "they may begin to question everything else." The soldier looked past Vogel, toward Carl, toward others watching. "Maybe they should question." The air went still. A single sentence had cracked open the unspoken taboo. An American MP wandered over, hands in his pockets. "Everything okay here, fellas?" Vogel stiffened. "Internal matter." The MP nodded lazily. "Just keep it down. Ball game's starting." As the MP walked off, the prisoners exchanged glances, some fearful, some thoughtful. Carl felt something shift deep inside him. Not anger, not rebellion, just the uncomfortable awareness that the Reich's iron grip on truth was loosening, even here, across an ocean. That night, after lights out, Carl lay awake, staring at the wooden beams overhead. The Americans didn't need to force ideas on them. They didn't need torture, didn't need pamphlets or propaganda. The camp itself was the propaganda, the food, the fairness, the dignity. Every act of humane treatment was a quiet blow to everything the Nazis claimed to be fighting. And the more Carl experienced it, the more he realized something terrifying. America wasn't winning the war here by bullets. They were winning by showing prisoners what a different world looked like.